Hey guys, welcome back to more HOA stories. Imagine moving into your dream neighborhood only to be slapped with bogus HOA fines from a power-tripping HOA president you have never even met. Now imagine finding out she broke more rules than anyone else and realizing you have the power to foreclose on her house. Here is what happened. And the title story starts like this. I moved into what seemed like a very nice neighborhood, but I didn't really pay much attention to the presence of the HOA beforehand. In retrospect, that was a big blunder on my part. For any of you looking to get a house in the future, make sure to check if there's an HOA and ask your neighbors just how invasive they are. You really don't want to save a bit on the house if it means you'll be living with a perpetual headache for years and years. See, I was specifically led to believe that the HOA had relatively low dues and not too many rules. That is what they told me, but if I had snooped around a bit, then I would have quickly discovered that the HOA loved to push the boundaries on exactly how they could penalize members. What seemed like a pretty reasonable list of regulations could be turned into a nightmare in the hands of a malicious HOA board. As such, I'd only been moved into the neighborhood for a couple of weeks before I received a notice from the HOA. They said that I had 3 separate violations already. My lawn was untidy, my house was too loud, and my trash cans were visible from the street. Initially, I panicked. I think everyone has been in my position at the moment, where you suddenly panic and think back on everything you did recently. Was I really being loud and bothering everyone else without even noticing it? Was my lawn really a mess and an embarrassment to the community? But then I took a breather and got very confused. After all, I'd only moved in a couple of weeks and I had cut my lawn once since then. Calling my lawn untidy seemed like an insane overstatement, so maybe they meant to send this complaint to a different house. My lawn looked about the same as every other lawn on my street, but who knows? As for the noise complaints, I briefly visited both my adjacent neighbors and apologized for the noise. I said that I hadn't realized how loud my music was, so I'd be sure to keep it down in the future. However, neither of my neighbors had any idea what I was talking about. They had not heard any noise at all coming from my house, so they definitely had not been the ones to complain. At this point, I was sure that these complaints had to have been meant for a different HOA member. Surely they just got the address and name wrong. Surely I was not being harassed right after moving into the neighborhood, right? Yeah, I think you can guess where this was going. The trash cans were the only complaint that I could somewhat understand. If you stood on the street in one very specific spot, then you could sort of see half of my recycling bin in my side yard. It was trivially easy to move it a bit further back, so it was impossible to notice, but I was still a little annoyed that someone had complained about it. Now there was nothing left to do but wait. I did not respond to the HOA directly, I just waited to see if they sent me any more violation notices. If this really had been a misunderstanding or a wrong address, then that would be the end of it, but I must confess that part of me was hoping that things might escalate here. I was feeling some serious righteous anger, and a big part of me was hoping that I'd get a chance to prove that these violations were complete nonsense. 1 month later, I got exactly what I wanted and then some. This time around, the HOA didn't just send notices, they sent actual fines. They did not even ask me politely to pay or give a phone number to call if I wanted to contest the violations. It was just a bill demanding that I pay, along with a list of further penalties that I'd incur for late payment. I was outraged. Each fine was for $150 to be paid in 2 weeks, and they were complaining about all 3 of the exact same issues. Don't worry, not for a single second did I consider just paying the fine and moving on. There was no way I was gonna take this lying down, so I hopped on the HOA website and looked for any phone number I could use to contest this. I ended up finding a management company who said that they didn't actually have any authority to resolve disputes like this. However, it was not a complete dead end because they directed me to the HOA meetings themselves. Apparently, this was not the sort of thing that I could deal with over the phone or through a website. I would have to go talk to the HOA board directly the next time they met. However, there was good news and bad news. The bad news was that the HOA board only met up once a year. Once I heard that, I almost laughed out loud. How insane was it that they offered me no way to contest violations except for a single evening per year? Depending on the timing, you could be getting harassed for over 11 months before receiving a chance to actually argue your case. Absolute insanity. However, the good news was that the next meeting was just a week away. I felt profoundly lucky, but more than that, I felt like the universe was on my side. And so, a week later, I headed over to the annual HOA board meeting to argue my case. I brought all sorts of documentation, including pictures of my trash cans from the street, evidence that my lawn looked the best on my street, and statements from my neighbors that I was not causing any noise problems. I did get there a bit early, so I had a chance to talk to some of the other homeowners that had shown up for their own issues. I quickly realized that we were all in the same boat with nonsense violations that we were all here to contest. I figured the night was gonna be a long one, but that was probably part of the HOA strategy as well. If they only gave us one night a year to officially complain, then they could make it such a hassle that most people threw up their hands and went home instead of toughing it out for hours on end. But I was not a quitter and I was pissed, so I sat and waited for my chance to talk to the woman they put in charge of handling fine appeals. She was quite a bit older than me, and I recalled seeing her around the neighborhood, but we had never chatted. After 5 minutes of talking to her, I realized how lucky I'd been for that. This woman hated me. From the way she sneered at me, you would have thought that I'd run over her dog and taken a dump on her lawn. She looked at me like I was just a piece of trash, and when I showed her my evidence, she just shoved it back in my face. To quote her verbatim, "Losers like you are the whole reason I joined the HOA board. Someone has to keep you honest, so go pay your fine and make the neighborhood a better place." Oh, and she was the vice president of the HOA. Did I mention that? Yeah, the number 2 of our HOA was that rude when I brought up a perfectly legitimate issue with their policies. Going into that evening, I thought there was a tiny chance this was all a misunderstanding, but not anymore. Even if this was some sort of mistake, it was clearly a result of snobbishness and disrespect. After that, I was so annoyed that I didn't go home immediately. I wanted to argue with the woman, but I had to wait until the actual meeting was over for an opportunity. As it turns out, that proved to be yet another stroke of good luck. I didn't know it beforehand, but these meetings were also used to vote on board members, either when a member wanted to step down or a member of the community wanted to replace one of the existing positions, there would be a vote. Since this meeting only happened about once a year, it apparently wasn't all that unusual for 3 out of the 5 positions to be up in the air at this particular meeting. As I understood the situation, there were a few members of the community that applied to be on the board, but you did not actually have to do that ahead of time. You could go ahead and nominate yourself right there at the meeting and get yourself in the running. Wanna guess what I did? Yep, I went ahead and nominated myself for secretary, which seemed to have the least competition. That wasn't particularly surprising because it required that you pay a lot of attention and take notes, but I did not have a problem doing that sort of work. If I'd had more time beforehand, I'm sure I would have been too stressed out and anxious to speak in front of the HOA, but since it was on such short notice and I was still so angry about the VP's attitude, I managed to get up there and give a pretty impassioned, persuasive speech, if I do say so myself. I tried not to get too off topic, so I basically just rambled about how HOAs are not there to make money, but rather to serve the community and make sure it is the best it could be. During the speech, the members of the board did not look particularly pleased, but their votes only counted as much as everyone else's. It's kind of silly to brag about it since the competition was almost non-existent, but I won the race pretty handily. Just like that, in a single hour, I went from disgruntled HOA member to the secretary of the HOA board. After most of the attendees went home, I then went and had a private word with the president. I was not really planning to tattle on the VP, but I did lay out my specific issues and mentioned that I was having trouble resolving them. At first I thought that the president was much more sympathetic. She seemed to be carefully examining the proof I had brought, and she was not sneering like the VP had been. However, when she opened her mouth, the first thing she said was that I needed to learn my place in the hierarchy. I was dumbfounded. She must have taken that for agreement because she continued saying that I was wasting her time with petty nonsense. Why was I making such a big deal out of these minor fines? She said that I should just pay them and not make the same mistake in the future. I simply couldn't believe it. She had carefully looked over the pictures and statements I had brought, then she dismissed them outright. Somehow this stung way more than just being dismissed outright. It was like the HOA did not even care about the truth, they just cared about keeping people in line. Feeling defeated, I went home, weighed my options once again and decided to pay the fine. Maybe there were some weeds on my lawn, but if I got rid of those, then surely they wouldn't be able to find me again. But don't misunderstand me, I was not rolling over, a plan was already starting to form in my mind, but it was gonna take a long while before it came to fruition. First, I had to get all my pieces in place. As secretary of the board, I was expected to attend every closed board meeting and take detailed notes. It was a pain, but at the same time, it gave me plenty of time to examine my enemy from every possible angle. I was able to learn exactly how they did things and how I could turn the situation to my advantage. Naturally, they said that I was not allowed to actually do anything at these meetings. My recommendations were shot down even when they were quite reasonable. On more than one occasion, I made a recommendation, was loudly rejected, and then a member of the board brought up a very slightly reworded version. Needless to say, they accepted my ideas when someone else said them and took credit. Honestly, I was not even surprised at that point. I also was not particularly surprised to later discover that this was actually a blatant violation of their own policies. I don't mean the stealing ideas part, because that was obviously wrong, but the rule that I was not allowed to propose any changes of my own. When I later went through the bylaws with a fine-tooth comb, I found out that every member's contributions were supposed to be considered equally, without any regard for whether it came from the president, treasurer, or any other position. After a few months of this, my first major opportunity presented itself. The president of the HOA decided that she wanted to implement some new fines regarding flower colors. Specifically, she wanted to impose fines on anyone that had flowers that were too bright on the basis that they were clashing garishly with the aesthetic of the rest of the community. If you're wondering where this came from, we all knew that the president had a neighbor she'd been feuding with for a few years now. That neighbor had been growing some wonderful bright pink flowers for as long as she'd been living there, or so I'd heard. Now, while a lot of the other petty bullying was ignored by the remainder of the HOA board, this went a few steps too far, so the president actually got some minor pushback during the meeting. However, nobody outright argued with her, so the meeting ended without incident or a resolution to the issue. Immediately afterwards, I went home and got on the messaging system that we used to coordinate HOA matters. At first, I was planning on starting an argument then and there about how tyrannical and unfair the president was being, but I ultimately decided to be a little subtler than that. Instead, I just acted enthusiastic and said I wanted to continue the discussion from before. That way, we could have a concrete solution ready for the next meeting. I didn't suggest that the president was being a bully, I just blew on the coals and hoped that tensions between the others would do the rest. I think it would have mostly been a failure if the president didn't come out of the gate typing a rant about how ugly these flowers all over the neighborhood were. She even started to post pictures that she had taken, but I think they did more harm than good because the flowers actually looked pretty nice. One of the other HOA members did stay on her side, but two others started to push back and disagreed with her. Remember that there were only 5 members on the board, so if there was a split, then I would end up as the tiebreaker. The argument escalated and I made sure to have a whole comment typed out and ready for how she would step down. However, at the last second I realized that maybe playing it subtle was the way to go again. Instead of attacking her, I expressed concern and said that maybe she was not up to the duties of HOA president, so perhaps she needed to take a break. I didn't call her unfit for the job, but that's exactly how she took it. She flipped out. I cannot even repeat some of the things she said, but to give you some idea of how bad it was, every single member of the board turned against her and decided to vote her off. The official reason was that she was targeting a community member for her own personal gain, but it was understood that everyone had just gotten sick of her bullying ways. She tried to change her tune after that, but it felt more like crocodile tears than a genuine change of heart. She said the board was the most important thing in her life and that nobody had done more for the neighborhood than her, but I don't think anyone was buying those lines from her. In fact, I'm not sure anyone had ever been on her side, they'd just been too scared of her bullying ways to really stand up to her. Now that the tide had turned though and she didn't have any power, everyone abandoned her. Of course, her getting kicked off meant that there was gonna be a vacancy on the board. It was likely that one of the other members would get bumped up to president, and then we were gonna recruit someone new for one of the lower offices, but that suited me just fine. With 1 member of the board down and 3 to go, I decided to go for something even less direct this time. At the first meeting, there had been a lot of HOA members that were complaining about their fines, but I think that was probably only a small fraction of the total. There were probably a lot of members that just ate the fines or ignored them, but were extremely unhappy about the entire situation. And I also figured that a lot of them would be ranting online. It was pretty easy to just monitor social media posts on places like Facebook and Nextdoor. You would be surprised at just how many instances I was able to gather. When it's just one here and there, it is easy enough to ignore, but once you start looking for the pattern, then the numbers really start to add up. In any event, I was playing the long game here, so I just waited for posts to pop up. Each time someone complained about an HOA fine, I chimed in helpfully, strongly advising that they should attend the next HOA meeting to appeal. If that didn't satisfy them, then I also gave them HOA contact info they could use to get their fines clarified. Sometimes it was my contact info, but I made sure that the other members got their phone numbers and email addresses thrown out there as well. Since I was properly dealing with all the requests that came my way, nobody could accuse me of sabotaging the process or targeting anyone. I was just happy as long as everyone else on the board had to actually deal with the issues of the community, even if it meant that I had to spend a few extra hours a month answering disgruntled messages. And let me tell you, this worked out far better than I'd ever dreamed. The other members of the HOA complained endlessly about having to answer these complaints, and when the next HOA meeting rolled around, there were dozens of people that showed up to contest their fines. Since I gave these HOA members all the info they needed to understand their rights, they knew exactly who they should be demanding answers from. Meaning the other 3 members of the HOA board, since we still hadn't filled the slot for the president. The whole process was made so much easier by the fact that I could truthfully say that none of my policies had been implemented in the HOA. They shot down all my proposals, so I was basically just the one taking notes. If any upset HOA members wanted to complain, then they just had to talk to anyone but me on the board. The meeting inevitably devolved into a shouting match, with the HOA board completely unable to control the room. Since there were so many people here specifically to argue about their fines, they dramatically outnumbered the HOA, especially since the president had been kicked out. By the time the end of the meeting rolled around, the 2 non-VP board members had straight up resigned. They were completely unwilling to deal with this level of chaos, and I didn't really blame them. This left just me and the VP still on the board, along with the need to fill the remaining seats. As it turns out, when you have 3 vacancies and just about everyone present in the room is furious about how things have been handled so far, you're gonna end up with 3 appointees that strongly disagree with the old guard. Just like that, an enraged crowd that had shown up to protest fines elected 3 of their own to the board, and now all the pieces were in place. The VP moved up to president, arguing that their seniority made the choice obvious, but I was perfectly happy to let that happen. It didn't matter what position she held when she was outnumbered 4-1, the next few months is when things really heated up. The new president channeled all the spirit of the old president, trying to implement more and more ridiculous fines. They argued that we needed to increase revenue, but nobody else on the board was buying it, especially not after I quietly shared my experience with the 3 new members behind Karen's back. She kept trying to introduce them, and we kept shooting them down. Every single time, she got a little angrier, but still, she did not quit. I had to give her some credit on that front. If nothing else, she was stubborn. However, the writing was already on the wall. As the new members settled into their positions, they made some very interesting discoveries. Specifically, the treasurer found some particularly pertinent details when they went through the records. As it turns out, our president had accumulated a few fines of their own to the tune of 5 figures. I'm still in awe that they managed to accumulate such an impressive amount of violation debt, but I guess those late penalties really added up. The president must have thought that she never had to pay those because she was too good to live by the same rules as the rest of us. And this is where things got really interesting. See, during our deep dive into the HOA's bylaws, and trust me, reading decades of petty bureaucratic nonsense was about as fun as watching paint dry in slow motion, we discovered some truly spectacular gems. However, the crown jewel? A bylaw that Karen herself had championed just 2 years prior, allowing the HOA to initiate foreclosure proceedings on any property with accumulated fines exceeding $10,000. At the time, she had probably imagined herself wielding this nuclear option against some poor schmuck who dared to plant the wrong shade of begonias. What she hadn't counted on was her own impressive talent for racking up violations while simultaneously believing the rules didn't apply to her. Our new treasurer, bless his meticulous spreadsheet-loving heart, had done the math. Between Karen's mysteriously dead grass, ironic considering my own lawn violations, her consistently overflowing garbage bins, noise complaints from her own late-night HOA strategy sessions, and about 47 other infractions she had somehow accumulated while busy terrorizing the rest of us, she had blown that past $10,000 threshold like a NASCAR driver with a death wish. The best part? Half these violations had been issued by the previous president back when Karen was vice president, and apparently those two had been locked in their own private Cold War for years, using HOA rules as weapons against each other. Who knew that all that pettiness would eventually come back to bite Karen in the most poetic way possible? When we called the special meeting to address a foreclosure matter, Karen strutted in like she owned the place, which technically she still did, for about 15 more minutes. "Finally going after the Johnson family with the hideous mailbox?" she asked, settling into her chair with the confidence of someone who had never considered that karma might have her address programmed into its GPS. "Well, not exactly," I said, sliding the violation summary across the table. "We are actually here to discuss your foreclosure, Karen." I've seen some spectacular reactions in my time, but Karen's face went through more expressions than a Shakespeare actor having a breakdown. First came confusion, her eyebrows knitted together like she was trying to solve calculus, and then recognition dawned and her mouth fell open wide enough to catch flies. The confusion morphed into indignation, how dare we, which quickly escalated to full-blown rage, lots of sputtering and gesticulating, before finally settling into what I can only describe as the look of someone who just realized they'd been playing chess while everyone else had switched to checkers. "You cannot be serious," she managed to croak out. "Oh, but we are," chirped our new treasurer, practically glowing with the joy of someone who had found a receipt for a tax deduction from 1987. Every fine documented, every late fee calculated, every penalty properly assessed according to the bylaws you helped establish. Mathematics don't lie, Karen. She tried to argue, of course, claimed the violations were bogus, that there had been some clerical error, and that we were all conspiring against her. It's really hard to argue with a paper trail that could stretch from here to the moon. The vote was swift and decisive though. 4-1, guess who the dissenting vote was? Karen didn't just leave that meeting, she fled, grabbed her purse, knocked over her chair, and practically sprinted for the exit while muttering something about lawyers and lawsuits. We later learned she had called in sick to work for the next 3 days, probably trying to figure out if there was any legal way to escape the beautiful trap she had built for herself. But here's where the story gets even better. So the foreclosure process takes time, lots of legal paperwork, court filings, mandatory waiting periods, and Karen had about 6 months before the hammer would actually fall. During those 6 months she could either pay up, fight it in court, or well, she chose option 3, complete radio silence. We later found out through neighborhood gossip that she was also dealing with a messy divorce. Her husband had apparently grown tired of being married to the neighborhood dictator and decided to cut his losses. Between legal fees for the divorce, the mounting HOA debt, and what looked like some other financial troubles, Karen was drowning. About 4 months into the foreclosure process, she simply vanished. One day her car was in the driveway, the next day it wasn't. She had abandoned the house entirely, leaving it to sit empty while the legal machinery ground forward. When the foreclosure finally completed, the house went to auction, and guess who was the only bidder who had done their homework on the property's condition and legal situation? Trust me, I told her. I have inside information about the seller's motivation to move quickly. The auction was held on the courthouse steps on a rainy Tuesday morning. I had done my research. The house had been sitting empty for months, and between the HOA liens and the divorce proceedings, nobody else wanted to touch it with a 10-foot pole. I got it for about 60% of market value, which seemed fair considering I would have to deal with all the deferred maintenance Karen had been ignoring while she was busy terrorizing the neighborhood. The inspection revealed the delicious irony: her own property was a walking advertisement for HOA violations. Dead spots in the lawn that looked like crop circles, a leaky gutter that had been dripping for so long it had carved a small canyon in her driveway, and landscaping that suggested she had been too busy policing everyone else's yards to maintain her own. But you know what? After spending 2 years systematically dismantling a tyrannical HOA regime, a little home improvement seemed like a relaxing hobby. Plus, there was something deeply satisfying about turning the former dictator's crumbling kingdom into the nicest house on the block. There was no awkward closing with Karen, she was long gone by then, the bank handled everything, and I never saw her again. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting people disappear into the consequences of their own making. These days, I'm running the HOA with what I like to call radical common sense. We instituted fine caps because nobody should face bankruptcy over grass height, quarterly meetings because democracy shouldn't be an annual event, and revolutionary concept and actual appeals process that does not require hiring a lawyer or sacrificing sacrificing a goat to the bureaucracy goats. The neighborhood is thriving, people actually talk to each other instead of just filing violations, kids play in yards without fear of someone measuring their chalk drawings with a ruler, and my former nemesis? Well, last I heard she had moved to a nice condo with no HOA at all. Probably for the best. I don't think she could handle living under someone else's rules after so many years of making them up as she went along. Every morning when I walk out to get my mail, I cannot help but smile at the irony. The woman who tried to make my life miserable over imaginary violations ended up losing her house to very real ones. And the best part? I didn't have to become the villain to win. I just had to be patient, strategic, and willing to let Karen's own petty tyranny be her downfall. Sometimes justice is not just sweet, it is absolutely delicious. And before we end the video, let's read one last story from r/PettyRevenge that you don't want to miss. It is titled, "My coworker never made a new pot of coffee, so I unplugged the machine right after she poured hers." There's an unspoken rule in our office: if you take the last cup, you make the next pot. One coworker, she never did. Every morning she would pour the last cup and walk off like she saved someone a step. So I waited, watched her fill her mug, smile and leave. Then I unplugged the coffee machine and walked away. Next person found an empty pot and a dead machine. People started asking who the last one was, and her name came up fast. She had to make a fresh pot under pressure. I enjoyed mine and did not say a word. And yeah guys, thank you for watching. I will see you again tomorrow, and please don't forget to check out my endless playlist on the left for endless content.